Okay, hello everybody, and welcome back. So today we are doing on our third class in forensic science, and we're kind of moving to the meat and potatoes really, because today we're going to start talking about a crime scene and what happens at the crime scene itself, whatever that crime is. So before I continue, just some housekeeping stuff. Normally, we do not have a class on Friday. I don't post a class on Friday. But tomorrow I will be posting class. That's so we can make up the 4 classes for this week. So tomorrow will be your 4th class. However, don't forget that you have a test on the weekend. And that is a multiple choice online test. All you do is you go to Canvas and look in quizzes, and you'll see it there, and you can open it and do it. Once you open it and begin, you'll have an hour and a quarter to complete it. I think it's 50 questions. We'll see. We'll hope everybody does well, but that test is not going to include anything that is taught from chapter 3. It will only be chapters 1 and 2. It's all the material from chapters 1 and 2. All right, so let's assume that a crime has occurred. How do we find out that a crime has occurred? Well, it is usually by a call to 911, by a witness or somebody who's concerned that something has happened, or it is a response of a patrol officer or somebody like that to a particular situation. And the first official who arrives at a crime scene is very often a patrolman, a responding police officer. And they immediately acquire a set of responsibilities. And the first is to see whether medical assistance is required. If medical assistance is required, that is the priority over everything else. And especially when that medical assistance is needed to save a life. Everything else becomes secondary. Preservation of evidence and everything, they will do their best, but saving life is the priority. If there is no need for medical assistance, the responding officer is responsible for immediately securing the scene and for identifying and detaining suspects and witnesses, making sure that witnesses are available for questioning, and as far as possible, keeping witnesses separate from one another so that stories can be checked one against the other, that the witnesses don't start to tell one another what happened. I will just here mention something to you. Eyewitness testimony still carries a huge amount of weight in a court of law. However, eyewitness testimony is about the most fallible of all evidence that can be presented in a crime. And it is really important at a crime scene to get witness statements as soon as possible, and before time has passed and before the witness has consulted with other people. This is for important. This is not because witnesses make up testimony. It's because of the fallibility of our memory. The greatest enemy to memory is time. The more time passes, the more the memory actually not only fades, the more the memory becomes manipulated. And memory can very easily be manipulated. A witness who sees something and clearly sees it happening, then goes and talks to 5 other people who tell them that something quite different happened, will very often begin to believe and create a memory that conforms with what the majority of people said. It's just a feature of the way our brains work. Memory is malleable. It's not a fixed quantity. And the more time passes and the more other outside and emotional influence gets placed on the memory, the more the memory will begin to change. And almost the worst kind of evidence is eyewitness testimony, which is delivered to a court after a lengthy period of time, and it should be regarded with great skepticism. It's not because we are weak, it's not because we are criminal or anything like that. It's simply because of the way our brains work. Physical evidence is not like that. Physical evidence remains essentially unchanged with time, and it's up to us to interpret that physical evidence. Nonetheless, this is one statement. Witnesses must be identified, contact information must be obtained so that statements can be taken from them as soon as possible. And of course, so they can be contacted later on as well. The responding officer is also responsible for securing the crime, doing an initial securing of the crime scene to stop interference with the crime scene as far as possible, to stop people coming in, going out. This can be very difficult because often a crime scene is somebody's home and you're essentially excluding them from their own home. But the problem is that any alteration of the crime scene can alter the picture which the criminalist is trying to build. And so it is the responsibility of the responding officer to clear that scene of interference, clear people out and keep them out. In addition, of course, the patrolman or officer responding has very well seldom got the expertise to analyze a crime scene or to collect evidence. They may see evidence which is very obvious and make a note of it, but their responsibility is then to call in people with the expertise to deal with the scene. And those are the detectives, evidence technicians, etc., etc. And those people themselves may recognize that they need specialized input, maybe, let's say, analyzing blood spatter. They may have to call, and they may call in the fingerprint experts to come and search for latent fingerprints and take the fingerprints, etc., etc. But there is a tremendous amount of responsibility on these first responding officers, and their response often makes the difference between a crime scene which is well preserved and can be examined in an orderly fashion, and a crime scene which has been radically altered and where a lot of evidence has actually, the value of a lot of evidence has actually been lost. The investigators, the responding officer will decide on an initial boundary where they will not allow people to enter the scene. But the investigators, probably in consultation with one another, will designate a crime scene which is much wider. And the crime scene should include the entire area where physical evidence might be gathered. And they will establish a perimeter. The familiar crime scene do not cross tape. That is a marker to say unless you are investigating, do not come across this line because you may alter a crime scene. Remember Locard's principle. Everybody entering a crime scene, bring something with them. Everybody leaving a crime scene, take something away. And what you bring in and take away may make a difference to the way that the crime scene is interpreted. So the number of people entering and how they enter is very strictly controlled. Usually that crime scene may be guarded. Many police precincts actually employ a security firm who subcontract to them to act as guards of the outside of a crime scene. The responding officers have another responsibility, and that is to begin to take notes, to begin to log exactly what they see at exactly what time, and exactly who enters the crime scene. And once they hand over the crime scene, then a very detailed log is kept of personnel movements in and out of the crime scene, and with the times and everything else, so that you can tell exactly how many people went in, who they were, and what it is that they did while they were in the crime scene. As far as possible, that crime scene should remain unchanged until the position and the relevance of all the physical evidence has been determined. That means, obviously, nobody enters the crime scene smoking. Nobody enters eating, drinking. People need to be really careful not to inadvertently drop a Kleenex that they've just blown their nose into or something like that. And you need to accept that movement in and out of the personnel is going to change the crime scene. But it needs to be kept to a minimum, and a record needs to be kept as far as possible so that we know what the origin of the change is. Sometimes a crime scene must be changed. Even the simple act of switching on a light to illuminate a scene is changing the crime scene. If that light was off when the responding officers arrive, a record needs to be made. The lights were off, responding officers switched the light on at such and such a time. Think of a crime scene, for example, somebody in an apartment building calls to say that their apartment is being flooded from upstairs. A responding officer goes into an apartment and finds a body in a bath with the faucet running, flooding the floor and flooding the apartments below. The responding officer is permitted to turn that faucet off, but a record has to be kept because there's a body in the bath, and a dead body can't switch off a faucet, right? The faucet was running. If in the subsequent reports, a new officer comes in and sees that the faucet is off, they may look at that and say, the faucet was off. Did the person in the bath switch the faucet off and then drown? Or what happened? A simple thing like that can radically change the story that a scene is telling. So it can be done if circumstances require it, but a careful record must be kept that it was done and who it was done by. The search of a crime scene needs to be very slow and very systematic. It must be meticulous. An initial glance through may reveal the outstanding items that are of interest, but initially they are not touched until some way of moving through the scene in an orderly fashion is arrived at. Very often, especially at a large crime scene or at an outdoor crime scene, they may adopt a search pattern using numerous personnel. And I'm not going to run through them. There are a couple of slides to show you the different search patterns that they might use. It's pretty obvious that they're all designed so that every inch of territory is carefully covered and to the borders of the crime scene. Their investigators will do an initial walkthrough of a crime scene. They will look especially for a likely way that a perpetrator entered the crime scene. And they will look for a likely way that the perpetrator left. And that may give them a path that the perpetrator took through the crime scene. That is very important, because that path may have objects, it may have footprints, it may have all sorts of physical evidence associated with it, and it is to be avoided by the investigators. The investigators will attempt to stay away from the route which a perpetrator is likely to have followed. Of course, they can't tell exactly necessarily, but they will stay away from likely routes to avoid disturbing them. All obvious items of evidence are immediately located, they are marked, and they are documented. Documented in ways which we'll discuss in a minute. but their position is documented without them being moved. The overall conditions need to be observed and logged, and they pay special attention to anything which looks like it is out of place. All of these searches need to be logical. They need to be done in an orderly fashion so that the entire scene is covered and carefully examined for evidence. There have been many cases where crucial evidence was left behind, was ignored or left behind, and lost its evidentiary value because of that. There have been instances where people have found bullet casings, for instance, under a couch or something, months and months and months after a crime was committed. But there's little evidentiary value to it because so much time has passed and so many people could have deposited it. Where if it had been found at the time, logged properly by investigators, its evidentiary value would have been preserved. So some of the physical evidence at the crime scene may be extremely obvious. It may be a blood-soaked hammer or a knife or something like that. That is relatively easy to spot. But a lot of physical evidence may in fact be extremely small, or it may be hidden. And this we refer to as trace evidence. And it may in fact be extremely small. It may be as small as hairs, grains of sand, chips of paint, fragments of glass. All of these things are likely to have evidentiary value. And this is the value of having an evidence technician who is trained to spot these kinds of pieces of evidence, because very often an investigator, a detective or whatever, is concerned with all sorts of other things. They are not necessarily concerned with collecting the small pieces of trace evidence. They may respond to the presence of large pieces of evidence, but they are much more interested in establishing relationships between suspects and victim or suspect and the premises which they've robbed or whatever, not necessarily looking for trace evidence. That very often falls to specialists to do, but it may reward the investigators by telling them a lot about how a perpetrator got entry, how they committed a crime, etc., as we'll learn as we go through consideration of different kinds of trace evidence. So the first thing to realize about a crime scene is that it is often very, very complex. Even an ordinary household, if you imagine just walking into your own lounge, sitting room, and without touching anything, just stand there and look at it, and look at the furniture, look where the furniture is placed, look at all of the objects, everything in the room. Look how complex that space actually is. Now think that in a crime scene, every single object in that room could have evidentiary value. And you'll realize how complicated it is to actually develop a picture of a crime scene and read the story the crime scene is telling you. In addition, as the investigation proceeds, the crime scene is gradually dismantled. It is changed. A body is removed. Obvious evidence is collected and removed. The crime scene changes and changes and changes. We need to have a record, a careful record of how it was at the beginning, and then how all that physical evidence was placed in the crime scene at the start. Once we've done that, then the evidence can safely be removed for further analysis in another location. So there are three things which are really important. The first are the notes. The notes, the written record of the crime scene begins with the responding officer. And it continues with everybody else who is brought in to examine the crime scene. And those notes are carefully written in a particular way. Those notes themselves may end up having to be presented as evidence in court. So it is the notes themselves, the observations by responding personnel themselves may have evidentiary value. So the second, of course, is photography. This is one of the most useful record-making techniques, and has been used since the 19th century, since the end of the 19th century, to record crime scenes. But we're going to learn that photography has to accomplish certain things at a crime scene. It's not a matter of just going there and snapping off pictures. They have to be done in a logical way, which will themselves tell a true story. The last is something that maybe you don't necessarily immediately think of, but it is in a way a form of note-taking, and that is the making of sketches. It is very, very useful to have handwritten sketches, because a sketch, the human eye can often pick up details and can pick up relationships between objects which are not obvious in a photograph. Oh, I must remember, of course, that photography may also incorporate videography. We'll talk about it in a minute. But the handwritten sketch can be tremendously important, because we can analyze as we're drawing. Drawing is a very useful technique, because it not only provides a record, it also forces the brain to process what it is seeing. And the story may begin to be told as somebody is actually doing their handwritten sketch. There may be limitations to what people can do, but it is usual that all three of these are utilized, especially at the scene of violent crime. Photography may be omitted at scenes like where of assault or whatever, or robbery, where it's not going to add really to the evidentiary story, but it becomes essential in cases of murder and of serious crime. So let me just, oh yes, it's just somebody sketching a victim. The crime scene notes, as I've told you, are an official record. This is not something which belongs to the person who wrote them. And the crime scene notes should clearly state how the investigator writing the notes ended up at the crime scene, who called them, what time did they arrive, when were they called, how were they called, etc. And it will include all of their first impressions, and it will include, for each person arriving should have a record of who was there when they arrived. Somebody should be in charge of keeping a personnel log of who enters the crime scene or who arrives at the crime scene. They may not necessarily enter the crime scene, but who arrives at the crime scene. And also what their expertise is. The fingerprint technician so-and-so arrived at such and such a time and commenced examination of the crime scene, etc. The notes are written in a notebook where the pages are numbered and they cannot be torn out, so that they cannot be altered. The notes cannot be altered without it being obvious that they have been altered. The notes are written in permanent ink, not in erasable pencil or erasable pen. And they are written by convention, they are written in blue or black ink. The photography and videography are the next most important recording techniques. And there is a little short movie for you here, which you can watch. The reason I don't show them while I'm talking, it doesn't work on Zoom for some reason or another. All sorts of weird things happen. Sometimes they play without audio. Sometimes you can hear the audio, but you can't see the movie, whatever. It's simpler for me just to refer you to these when you are reviewing this class, as you should do, as soon as possible after it is finished. View these little movies. They're just short. So this is a standard single lens reflex digital camera. These are really now state-of-the-art cameras and pretty much standard issue to any photographic unit at a precinct or a laboratory or wherever the photographer is located, whoever is employing them. In addition, there are obviously various video cameras as well that can be used. And these nowadays are light, handheld, and extremely high quality. That is a relatively recent advent. Before, video cameras were very bulky, and the cinematography was not necessarily that good. I'll show you in a second. So this is a typical, very easy to use digital single lens reflex camera, but with enormous capabilities. And one of the great things about them, they do have flash photography, obviously, but one of the great things about these is they're fantastically sensitive in dim light, which was, for film photographers, was always a huge problem, where they had to use flash, which sometimes introduces artifact into the photograph. These digital cameras can deal with very low light, still produce a good image even without the use of flash. So the other thing, a huge advantage of digital cameras is the photographer can see what they've taken immediately. That's just amazing, because in the old days, they'd take film, they'd have to take it back, develop it, look through it. Oh, I forgot to take this photograph, or I didn't get, or this photograph from this view failed for some reason or another, and I've got to go back and try and repair or whatever. The digital camera you can see immediately, and if you need to take a shot again, you can take it. The other thing, which is just extraordinary, is that resolution is so fantastic on digital cameras now. 12 megapixels, which is a standard now for digital cameras. That is the resolution. A conventional film only gives you about 5 megapixels. This means that you can blow up a picture enormously and still preserve the detail. And that can be an extremely useful facility when you're examining a crime scene. And as very often happens, an investigator in examining photographs spots something that was not spotted by eye at the crime scene. But there it is lodged in the photograph, in the official photographs, where it can easily be found. So the other thing is that all sorts of manipulations can be done of the photographs. For example, they could be stitched together into panorama, but they can also, there are ways of, if you have enough photographs, of stitching them together to produce a three-dimensional model of the crime scene, which is extremely useful, not only to investigators, but when they present their evidence in court, because they can lead a jury through a crime scene without having to take the jury to the crime scene itself. There is one big disadvantage, however, and that is that these digital photographs are very easily manipulated. They can be altered with Photoshop or any photo editing system, whatever. So a careful record has to be kept of whoever has the chips or whatever, any computer record of the photographs in their possession. The manipulation of these photographs is very easily spotted. However, any digital forensic investigator can very easily see that an image has been altered, prove that an image has been altered, if it should be called into question by a defense attorney, for example, then it can be submitted to forensic investigation, and it can be very easily be shown whether or not it was altered. So there is a particular way in which the photographers operate at a crime scene. And the first is for each part of as far as possible, an overview of the crime scene is taken. And then for each part, say the crime scene includes a house with several rooms. The photographer may take pictures of the outside of the house to establish where the entry is, where the exits are, etc. And then take photographs which, as far as possible, show something of the layout of the house, and then overviews of each of the rooms with particular emphasis on any area where a particular crime has taken place. So there are overview photographs which allow, for example, a jury or an investigator using the photographs to orient themselves, as if in their minds they can place themselves in the crime scene and know what they would be looking at if they turn their head to the left or to the right. Then the photographer will move into the crime scene and will do a kind of views of the crime scene while they are actually unaltered as far as possible. The photographer should be, for example, if there has been a murder, the photographer should be called while the body is still present in the scene, because the placement of the body is the most important piece of evidence at the scene, and its placement and everything else needs to be carefully recorded. The crime scene is photographed in a very logical fashion, and we've seen how we photograph the overall scene first. Then the photographer will begin to move to individual pieces of evidence. Now, it's not the photographer's job to spot the evidence. It is the other investigators, and they mark the presence of evidence with evidence markers, which are usually numbered, and that piece of evidence acquires that number in the logs of evidence. And the photographer will take a view which includes the view of the overall scene with the marker visible, so that the placement of that piece of evidence is clear. And then once they have done that, once they've taken overview and then they've taken this kind of medium range photograph, they may move to a close-up. Okay, so here's an overall view. This is an actual crime scene. This is an overall view of this kitchen area where this, I presume, a murder, because since it's a body, took place. What the photographer is trying to do here is she is including, very importantly, this door. This door provides an orientation for a viewer. The photographer can now move to a different viewpoint, but he'll probably try to keep something like that door in the photograph somewhere, so that anybody viewing a sequence of these photographs will be able to piece them together. You stitch in your mind, stitch them together into a view of the whole room. Here, for example, this series of photographs actually is done correctly, as if we were walking through a crime scene. We are walking through a crime scene up to a particular piece of evidence. So here is this is not the overall view. This is a medium range view of the scene. In actual fact, you can see these bright orange there and there. Those are the evidence markers. And there is, in fact, a body lying on this bed here. This gives us an overall view of the entrance to this to this room where this crime has taken place, and the placement of specific pieces of evidence. So that is the medium range view. Now the photographer begins to move in closer, and here is the evidence marker. You cannot yet clearly see that there is in fact a bullet cartridge case here, lying there. You can't see details of it, but you can see its placement. We go back to this view now. Suddenly the thing, can you see how in your mind now you've been able to add this photograph and this one together? Now the photographer moves in really close and photographs the piece of evidence as it is placed without it having been touched or moved. This was its placement. The photographer, she takes the photograph with a scale so that this can be, the size can be determined. In fact, this is such a good photograph, you can tell it's a 45mm bullet casing. And once this photograph has been taken, this piece of evidence can be moved. It can be bagged carefully and kept because we have a complete record of its placement. When it does not any longer have to sit there. And that is the way the photographer and the evidence gatherers work together through the crime scene. Finally, the photographer, that piece of evidence may be moved, and the people gathering the evidence may ask the photographer to please take a separate photograph, a clear photograph of the evidence placed so that it is entirely visible with scales in order to record its size exactly. The most important set of photographs that a photographer can take is at the scene of a murder, because as I said, the body is the most important piece of evidence. And before the body is moved, before anything around it is altered, the photographer will usually record the body, close-up of wounds on the body, and any weapons, etc., any likely weapons that are lying in the vicinity of the body. The whole placement of the body, how it landed, where it is, marks around the body, implements around the body, all of these things are critically important, and the photographer provides the permanent record of their placement. That is coupled, of course, with notes from other investigators and often with a hand-drawn map, with a drawn map. The videotaping is extremely useful, especially nowadays where we have very high quality video to do the recording. Again, it's done rather the same. The video is done in a logical way. It needs to be carefully filmed so that it doesn't actually become confusing. If video is taken too quickly, if it omits parts of a room, if it omits parts of a crime scene, the viewer is unable to place themselves and unable to relate the pieces of evidence together. It's very important that the video be informative as possible. So often they will narrate as they take the video. So there's an audio narration, and the videographer will often make notes or will coordinate with somebody making notes so that the two can be tied together. They will often clear a scene when they're taking a video record because they don't want extraneous imagery, people walking across, etc., but especially they don't want extraneous conversation. All they want is a simple narration of where the videographer is and what they are photographing. You can also take still photographs from video. That's perfectly acceptable. But sometimes the quality of an individual video frame is not that good. So it is coupled with digital camera photography. I have included this for you. The first in the United States, the first video footage admitted as evidence in court was in 1980. Do go and watch this because it's it's a real crime, of course, this is real evidence, etc. But it is quite illuminating to see how poor this film actually was. Yes, it was still admitted to court. How poor it is, how poor the photography is, and the cinematography and everything, how shaky it is, and it jumps from this scene to that scene, and it goes this way, and the image itself is all grainy, and yet they could still derive useful evidence from that poor film. Here's another thing, this is by no means present in all laboratories or precincts, but here is a very, very useful piece of equipment. This is a computer-controlled scanner, and this has this very high resolution camera, and it combines it with a laser rangefinder, which gives distances, very, very accurate distances. And it rotates and it snaps off hundreds of photographs, one after the other, and then they are coupled together into a very, very accurate three-dimensional model of an entire crime scene. You can see it here with all of the different rooms, the entrances, the exits, everything else. This is a real crime scene. There is actually a body here on this couch back here. And this is extremely useful because remember that crime scenes are often living spaces. And the crime scene is going to be closed eventually and no longer be available to investigators. In addition, the investigator later on may have to lead jurors through a crime scene. And it's very, very useful to have a digital image like this that you can actually walk them through. So here's another one. This is from Australia. And this is a still photograph, obviously. But this is an interactive crime photograph. Each of these little red dots here doesn't work for us, but anybody viewing the entire photograph can click on this link here. Sorry, it takes me to the wrong place, but can click on that link there, and it takes them immediately to the piece of evidence collected at that scene, maybe a fingerprint on this glass door or something like that. And it will, this hyperlink embedded in the image takes you to probably a picture of the fingerprint and the analysis and the identification maybe of the person who left the fingerprint, etc., etc. A very, very useful way for investigators to keep a record, because a single crime scene may yield hundreds of pieces of evidence. And keeping straight in all of the recording and in people's minds where that evidence came from and what its significance was can be a very difficult task. This is a very good way of doing it. The value of sketching a crime scene really can't be overemphasized. Despite all of this high-tech stuff, digital photography, the digital videography, etc., that we have, what the human eye sees and what the human brain analyzes at a crime scene can itself be very, very significant. And there's huge value to these sketches made. So, but they are done in a particular, this is not an artistic endeavor. The sketches show the layout of the crime scene, and they show the relationship of all significant items and features. Now, here's what's really useful, because as I've said before, you walk into an ordinary lounge and it may be cluttered with objects. And only after investigation do investigators decide which objects in that room have evidentiary value. The sketch, the human sketch, can highlight those particular objects and place them in a map, essentially, and reveal a relationship between those objects. So that sketch can then be tied to everything, all the other recording, to the notes, to the photographs, to the videos, etc., etc. But it provides a very clear indexing of evidence present at the crime scene. It's very important that those sketches show scale. So, for example, each sketch must have who did the sketch, where was the sketch done. It must show a scale of distance. It must show where cardinal north is, etc., etc., so that anybody looking at the sketch can orient themselves and can place themselves in space in that sketch and know what. Usually, the person doing the sketch will include in the sketch distances between objects. So, for example, have a look here, and what they've done is they've measured the size of this here, they've measured this distance here, and they may provide distances between things if it's important. This is the hand-drawn sketch. It shows the entrance and the exit, which immediately implies a possible path of action of a perpetrator. This hand-drawn sketch is essentially notes, but it can then be neatened up and for presentation in court. But nowadays, they will also use computer-assisted drawing programs in order to produce this final sketch. And they may actually also be able to produce some sort of three-dimensional. But this, the important thing to notice about this sketch is how simple it is. It has picked out the really salient features of this crime scene and is providing us with distances of one object to another. How far away from the wall does this body lie? It shows that there are blood marks here. It shows placement of pieces of evidence elsewhere on in the sketch, etc., etc. So, having noted the presence of pieces of physical evidence and having made a careful record of where they are located by photography, videography, sketch, and notes, etc., the evidence now needs to be collected. And it needs to be collected in a meticulous fashion. There are many cases which have failed to arrive at a verdict because evidence was collected sloppily, and its evidentiary value was lost. It needs to be remembered that at a crime scene, what you see first is what is visible. Much of the evidence may be very small and may only be apparent on close examination, and some evidence may be hidden. It may be under something. It may have been deliberately hidden. And so the crime scene needs to be carefully searched in order to pull out every possible piece of evidence. In addition, important evidence may be collected inadvertently, very often on clothing. So, for example, the clothing of the deceased, the body itself is important evidence, but the clothing of a deceased person is evidence. The clothing of a suspect is evidence and is collected because it may collect evidence. It may collect trace evidence, hair, fiber, DNA, body fluid, etc., etc. These carriers of evidence, clothing, that sort of thing, it also extends to things like the furnishings in a room. So, for example, carpets gather material. They gather hair, skin, they gather blood spots, etc., etc. Very often, if a crime scene the area is carpeted, they will vacuum the carpet and collect the vacuum detritus for examination. In a crime of violence, not necessarily murder, but any crime of violence, very often there is hand-to-hand combat between people, and people accumulate evidence underneath their fingernails, scratching one another, for example. And fingernail scrapings have often proved to be an extremely important piece of physical evidence. On a body, they will very often bag the hands in a porous bag, in a breathable bag, and it is the responsibility of the person doing an autopsy to do the fingernail scrapings. But in a case of living persons, fingernail scrapings may be taken by responding officers or by an evidence technician. Every single piece of evidence, it is critical that the evidence, as far as possible, it be processed in such a way that it is not contaminated and that it is changed as little as possible. Some change is inevitable, as I'll discuss, but that is change is as little as possible before it is processed by whatever expert needs to see it. Evidence needs to be packaged in such a way that it does not get contaminated, it doesn't break. One piece of evidence is not allowed to bump up against another, scratch and mark it or chip it or whatever. It should never be packaged in such a way that it can be bent or scratched or anything like that. So this issue of collection and of packaging is very, very important. The procedure, usually nowadays, people will, before even entering a crime scene, they will ensure that they are wearing gloves. Very often nowadays, because of the importance of DNA evidence, people entering a crime scene will wear a head covering, booties very often. And they will use disposable implements like disposable forceps or whatever, so that if they're serially collecting, they can use a series of different implements to do the collection so they don't contaminate from one to the other. Every item, ideally, should be placed in a separate container. This means that, first of all, it is isolated from other pieces of evidence, but it also means that a careful record is kept of each individual piece. Each individual piece has an identity, usually an identity number, so that it can be tracked through the entire process of collection and then of examination. And it's always packed into appropriate protective containers, which will preserve it as closely as possible to its original state. So any evidence collector is going to, when you see them arrive, they're going to have boxes of bags of different kinds of things, envelopes, packets, tins, all sorts of things. And we'll just have a look. This is a typical manila evidence envelope. And you will notice as we go through that paper is used much more commonly than plastic for collection of evidence. And that is because paper actually breathes. If you package things in, even if you package paper inside plastic and it's kept, remember that evidence may be kept for many, 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 many months before it is used. It can tend to go moldy. If you package in paper, paper breathes and growth of molds and bacteria is limited. In addition, just point out, this is specially designed so that when you seal it, there is a complete seal. That means that inside of the envelope is completely sealed. You could even put powders in here and they would not leak out. So it's not like an ordinary envelope, mailing envelope, or which has great gaps at the side of the flap. These do not. In addition, I won't detail at the moment, but just take note of all of this on the front of the evidence envelope because we're going to refer to it in a while. This is critically important, that you can write on these containers. These are metal pill boxes, also very, very useful very often. For example, those bullet casings, such as the one we saw in the photograph, a bullet casing might be packaged in a pillbox like this. They can also package pieces of glass or whatever. And if need be, it can be wrapped in paper or wrapped in cotton in order to protect it inside so that it doesn't rattle around inside the pillbox. Again, paper covering so that this can be written on, and probably that who collected it, who the evidence number, the crime scene, its number, etc., etc., etc. The docket number for this particular crime, etc., may all be written on the lid. This is a sealable plastic evidence bag, and these are useful. For example, let me just show you this here. This is called a druggist's fold, and this is used for collecting very small pieces of evidence, such as if they spot hairs or whatever on a victim or suspect's clothing, paint chips, very small pieces of glass, etc., etc., can be dropped into a druggist's fold. It's just folded paper, which is then folded so that it's completely sealed inside. And those would very often be placed into a plastic holder like this. There's no need to worry about something like glass or metal getting mold on it. So they can be safely sealed in plastic like this. These here are special cans which are used at scenes of arson, because at an arson scene, very, very frequently, an arsonist will use an accelerant, a fuel like gasoline or kerosene to start the fire. And very, very often that gasoline, kerosene, the starter fluid is not completely burned. It actually soaks into the materials around it. And the surface of it burns, but the charcoal, wood, etc., that's left behind actually still has residue in it. And they're placed, that sort of evidence is placed in an air-sealed, airtight can like this. And you'll see that in the top it has a rubber bung. And an injection syringe can be introduced into that. And the head space here can be sampled. Sometimes they will actually heat the can to evaporate the materials into the head space, and that can then be sampled for analysis. This is special for arson cases. You realize, judging by what we have said about DNA and about its increasing importance in crime scene analysis, that biological samples have acquired a particular importance in forensic science, and they are very, very carefully collected. The very first thing about the reason why they need such special handling is when you collect a sample from a crime scene, a blood-stained sheet or a semen stain on a sheet or something like that, it may actually be damp when it is collected. If you then take that and you put it into an airtight situation like a plastic bag or something like that, bacteria and molds, it will actually decay. The bacteria and molds will grow. So these stains are usually dried first of all before they are processed and sent off to a lab. If they cannot be collected dry, then they can be placed into paper container, like paper bags, etc., which offer them the chance of drying out inside the paper bag. So that is the first thing. You need to ensure the bacterial and mold growth is limited on such a sample. Any of these big evidence bags, and these are carefully sealed, and they are usually sealed with a tape over the seal, as most of these envelopes will be. They'll be sealed with a tape over the seal with the signature of the person who sealed it, so that when that bag is open, that signature is broken, the seal is broken. And when it is resealed, the person who seals it again will again seal it with another tape and put a signature on, so the careful record is kept of who has opened the evidence, opened and examined this evidence. The really critical thing with DNA is to prevent contamination. That is the reason why people now very often enter with heads covered, gloves on, and even masks on, etc., etc., so that their own DNA does not contaminate likely evidence-containing DNA. If need be, then a biohazard label should be attached. There are cases where material cannot be dried. Gruesome to discuss it, but maybe a body part or a piece of flesh or something like this might be important evidence. And in that case, if it cannot be air dried, well, it is placed into an airtight container and is refrigerated until such time as it can be examined and processed. I think I've covered all of this. Yes, the only other important thing to say, in packaging biological materials, they are always packaged individually. So, for example, if you collected a sheet, a bed sheet, and the pillow slips, the bed sheet and the pillow slips would be housed separately from one another, so that they do not rub against one another and they do not cross-contaminate between them, because they may contain different. A pillow slip may have hair on it, where a bed sheet has blood stains or semen stains or something like that. So, right. This is, remember I said you take a careful look at all of those forms and everything that are on the front of those envelopes. Here's a critically important feature of packaging of evidence. And that is that all evidence is submitted via what is referred to as a chain of custody. In other words, the very first person to collect that evidence places it in holding, in whatever, in their paper bag, in its plastic bag, or whatever. They provide all of the evidence here, all of the information rather, about the crime, the precinct, etc., whatever agency it is that is collecting this evidence. And they provide a brief description, often a case number, for example, and maybe a brief description of what is in the envelope and what its relevance is. The chain of custody starts with the very first person, and they give their name, etc. And then when they hand it over to somebody, they have to enter who it is that they're giving it to, and they provide the date. Then the person who's received it has to provide their identity here, and to whomever they gave it. Eventually, it probably at the very end, after it's been through lots of people have examined it, it will end up here in an evidence locker, but there will be somebody who is in charge of that evidence locker, and that person is in charge of safeguarding evidence as it is stored. And so the chain of custody will often end with the guardian of the evidence locker, or whatever endpoint the evidence ends up at. This chain of custody is critically important. There are many, many cases where a clever defense attorney has asked to see the chain of custody for a critical piece of evidence from a case, and has discovered that it has exited the chain of custody. There is a gap where we do not know who had custody of this piece of evidence. The implication being that in that gap, things could have happened of which we have no record, because each person in this chain of custody should have a record in notes, results, etc., of what they did with that piece of evidence and what the results of their investigation were. If it disappears from the chain of custody for any length of time, even a half an hour, it exits the chain of custody. We have a period of time when we do not know what was happening to it, and it loses its evidentiary value. and this has been spotted by clever defense attorneys in many cases, and in some cases it has been shown that during that exit from a chain of custody, nefarious things were in fact done to the piece of evidence. It was contaminated deliberately to implicate somebody, for example, is the kind of thing that might happen. Much of this, the evidence that is collected at a crime scene nowadays will be sent to a laboratory, to a crime scene laboratory. In the old days, a lot of the evidence would be dealt with in-house in a precinct, for example. The detectives would deal with it as far as possible. They may have fingerprint people in the precinct, etc. But nowadays, it is much more common that an overarching agency like a crime laboratory will deal with it. And so much of this evidence is going to be transferred from the investigating authority, the officers or whoever is doing detectives, etc., to the crime scene laboratory. They will process it, obtain results, and they will refer their results back to the investigators. And the investigator's job is to put it all together and assess its relevance in attempting to point to a suspect and to their guilt. The crime scene laboratory will insist that all evidence submitted to them is very, very carefully documented. And they will usually have a standard form. It varies from lab to lab, but they will have a standard evidence submission form where all of the evidence being submitted to them is logged, and all of its information is carefully recorded. So it comes to them, it enters into their chain of custody. So they will carefully record the chain of custody once it arrives. It can be mailed, doesn't necessarily have to be hand carried. But if it is mailed, it is mailed in such a way that the mailing container is sealed, so that if that mailing container has been opened at all, a record has been made of who opened it and why when it arrives at the laboratory. Here's a typical lab form listing all of the evidence that is contained in that particular batch, together with case information, etc., and numbering of the items. And the laboratory will maintain this identity so that any results can be tied back immediately to a particular piece of evidence. Again, I've explained the chain of custody to you. It's a chain of continuity of possession. That is its definition. And nowhere should there be a blank space where we don't know who received it or who transported it or whatever. It should always be absolutely clear that if need be, every single one of those people can be called into court and under oath have to testify, yes, I handled it on such and such a date. I received it from so-and-so and I handed it to so-and-so. Here's something which laboratories will often insist on, but which investigators quite often, surprisingly enough, forget. And that is that much of the evidence which is going to be gathered at a crime scene is what we refer to as being questioned evidence. Let me give you an example. If we find a latent fingerprint at a crime scene, it may be a beautiful fingerprint, completely clear, they collect it. It has, in and of itself, it has no value. It has no value as long as you're just sitting looking at a fingerprint. It's a question piece of evidence, and it needs to be compared to something. It needs to be tied to, in the case of a fingerprint, it needs to be tied to someone who could produce that exact same fingerprint. So the fingerprint collected is a questioned item. And when we have a suspect and we take her fingerprints, that is a known or a standard or a reference sample. We are taking a sample from a known source. The same thing applies, for example, if we get DNA evidence from a scene. That DNA evidence in and of itself is of no value unless we have a standard reference sample that we can refer to, DNA drawn from suspects that we compare our questioned DNA to in order to show a link. Very often, evidence will arrive at a laboratory, for example, and it will just be the stain. And it will remain that way for a very long time. Obviously, initially, there may not be a suspect. There may not be anybody that you can refer to. But the laboratory will often remind investigators that their evidence is useless unless they can provide a standard sample. And the laboratory will often bug the investigators to do so as soon as possible, provide them with standards that they can analyze. This is just something which our brains don't always compute. We see a likely piece of evidence and we think that that in and of itself is of enormous significance, forgetting that it needs actually to be tied to a reference in order to acquire its evidentiary value. Once the crime scene has been completely processed as far as investigators and experts are concerned, the lead investigator will decide when the crime scene can be left, when the crime scene tape can be lifted. This is often, there is tremendous pressure on investigators to do this as quickly as possible because crime scenes are very often living spaces. And families need to get back in. They need to begin processing what has happened. They need to begin cleaning up, which can be a dreadful task, but it's not the responsibility of investigators to do so. This issue of cleaning is very significant because once a scene has been cleaned, any residual evidence will quite probably be lost. And any evidentiary value, even if they find something, is very often lost once the crime scene has been opened. So the investigators try to make very, very certain that they've gathered every piece of evidence that they can. They can return to a scene that, if need be, but the likelihood of them gathering evidence of real value diminishes once the scene has been opened. Now, just to finish off this discussion, we need also to briefly consider what the law says about removal of evidence, identification and removal of evidence. Because in actual fact, there are very strict constitutional rules about what authorities can in fact collect. And these are largely governed by the Fourth Amendment, by privileges conferred on all of us by the Fourth Amendment, which states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable search and seizure. That is the critical phrase there. Unreasonable search and seizure shall not be violated. No warrant shall issue but upon probable cause. In other words, first of all, in order to gain entrance and begin searching for evidence, you need a warrant. There needs to be a good, provable reason why authorities should enter premises or property in order to begin searching for evidence. And that has to be supported by probable cause. In other words, authorities must be able to prove the likelihood that a crime has been committed. And that must be done in a court, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. This brief paragraph here assures us all that police cannot simply knock on our door, enter, and start looking for things. In order to enter the property, it has to be firmly established that it is likely that a crime has been committed. Now, in the case of something like a robbery or of a murder, it is very easy for authorities to suggest that a crime has been committed at that particular place. And they are easily covered by the Fourth Amendment. But it becomes a lot more difficult when, for instance, something like an occasion arises. For instance, a suspect is identified and the police firmly believe that their dwelling place contains evidence which pertains to a crime somewhere else. In order to enter that person's premises and collect items from their home, the investigating officers have to go to a court of law. They have to go to a judge, and they have to submit a warrant for entry. And in applying for that warrant, they need to satisfy all of the precepts of the Fourth Amendment. They need to tell the judge why it is likely that this person is involved in this crime. They don't have to prove that they are involved in the crime. They have to say why it is likely that this person may be involved in the crime. They have to describe to the judge where this person lives and what it is they may have to do to gain entrance, what they will do to try and gain entrance. And once they have gained entrance, exactly what it is they are looking for. Exactly what it is they are looking for. Are they looking for a gun? You need to tell the judge, we are searching for a gun involved in a particular crime. They cannot go into the premises and start just randomly collecting stuff and walking off with it. If they spot stuff inside the apartment or house or whatever, which they think may be related to the crime, but it was not specified in the warrant, they may need to go and get another warrant in order to collect that. It affords us a very, very important set of protections, and many cases have founded because it's been found that even very, very significant evidence was collected under unreasonable search and seizure, that they broke the strictures of the Fourth Amendment in collecting evidence, and it gets thrown out of court and the case is lost. So it's very important that this is followed. So this search and seizure without a court-approved warrant is occasionally justified. It is, first of all, in the existence of emergency circumstances, such as there has been a murder. You would have, authorities would have allowance to enter those premises immediately, begin gathering evidence, etc., because of that situation. They're also permitted to enter premises and seize evidence to prevent its immediate loss or its destruction. For example, if they suspect that somebody is busy shredding documents which are relevant to a crime, they can break in and stop them. This also applies, for example, at scenes of arson, where a fire is burning and there is evidence which may be lost in the fire. They are permitted to collect it. A person and property can be searched if that person has been arrested and the property or the car, the house, whatever, is in the immediate control of that person who has been arrested pertinent to a particular crime. This is very important that their arrest be pertinent to investigation, that the evidence, they can't go in and collect evidence for another crime. If they see the evidence of another crime, they can go get another warrant, but they can't collect evidence of another crime when they're investigating something. The last is all of the privileges of the Fourth Amendment are waived if it can be shown that the parties consented to a search. Even if a investigating officer at the front door says, may I come in and look at your house? May I come in and examine your house? They say, yes, that's giving permission. for a search. So that if a person says, no, you may not, that's it. They need to go and get a warrant in order to gain entrance. Okay, so that's it for today. A little bit longer than normal, but in any case, remember, I will post a class tomorrow. That will be our 4th class for this week. I hope you're all doing well. Christ. I forgot to record it.